The life of Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky began on May 7, 1840, in the industrial town of Votkinsk, located in the Vyatka Governorate of the Russian Empire. Born into a family of middle-ranking civil servants, he was the second of 6 surviving children. His father, Ilya Petrovich Tchaikovsky, was a mining engineer and the overseer of a local ironworks, while his mother, Alexandra Andreevna, came from a family with distant French ancestry. This background placed Tchaikovsky at the intersection of Russian provincial life and the broader European cultural currents influencing the empire. The Russian Empire of the mid-19th century was a place of profound contrasts, rigid in its autocratic political structure, yet increasingly exposed to European intellectual and artistic developments. In such a setting, the Tchaikovsky household was relatively cultured, especially for a provincial family. Music held an important place in domestic life. Alexandra played the piano and often entertained the children with European melodies, while the father, though not musical, supported the idea of cultural refinement as part of his children's upbringing. Tchaikovsky's earliest exposure to music came not through formal education, but through the ambient sounds of home. It was his mother who recognized the child's acute sensitivity to music. She introduced him to the piano, an instrument that would become both a source of joy and an outlet for his emotions. At the age of 5, he began taking piano lessons from a hired tutor, quickly demonstrating a natural aptitude that far exceeded the family's expectations. However, in 19th century Russia, a career in music was not considered appropriate for someone of his social standing, and his talents were seen more as a genteel hobby than a serious vocation. One of the most significant emotional imprints of his early life was the death of his mother in 1854, when Tchaikovsky was only 14 years old. She succumbed to cholera after a brief and sudden illness. Her death devastated him and left a psychological scar that would manifest throughout his life and music. Biographers have often noted that this early trauma instilled in Tchaikovsky a lifelong association between beauty, loss, and melancholy, emotions that permeate many of his later compositions. Tchaikovsky's relationship with his family was complex. While his father encouraged educational advancement, he never fully understood Pyotr's emotional intensity or his musical ambitions. Moreover, his siblings played varied roles in his early development. His younger brother Modest would later become one of his closest confidants and biographers. These early familial interactions laid the groundwork for Tchaikovsky's understanding of loyalty, dependency, and affection, concepts he would revisit repeatedly in his compositions. In 1850, at the age of 10, Tchaikovsky was enrolled in the Imperial School of Jurisprudence in St. Petersburg, a boarding school designed to prepare boys for civil service. While this marked the beginning of his formal education, it also represented a sudden and jarring departure from the familial warmth of home. Isolated and emotionally fragile, young Pyotr struggled with the discipline and cold atmosphere of institutional life. Nevertheless, he found some solace in music, which remained a constant companion, though now relegated to stolen moments between classes and study. During these school years, Tchaikovsky had limited access to formal music training. The school lacked a structured music curriculum, but Pyotr took private piano lessons and participated in informal musical gatherings. His enthusiasm for opera and symphonic music grew as he attended public concerts and performances, experiences that deepened his desire to engage with music at a professional level. Still, such aspirations were kept largely to himself, as the path he was on pointed squarely toward bureaucratic service. The cultural climate of St. Petersburg during Tchaikovsky's adolescence offered both inspiration and constraint. The city was a hub of Western influence, where German, Italian, and French art and music flourished alongside an emerging Russian nationalist sentiment. While the young Tchaikovsky was enthralled by the Western canon, particularly the works of Mozart, whom he would idolize throughout his life, he also absorbed the rising tide of Russian cultural pride. This duality would later inform the stylistic tension in his music between European form and Russian emotion. Despite his love for music, Tchaikovsky dutifully completed his education and entered government service in 1859. At this stage, music was still a passion, but not a profession. However, the seeds had already been sown. The loss of his mother, the emotional solitude of boarding school, and his exposure to both European and Russian musical traditions had shaped a sensibility that was introspective, emotionally rich, and deeply expressive. These were not yet the hallmarks of a composer, but they would soon become so. In examining the early life of Pyotr Tchaikovsky, it becomes clear that his formative years were characterized by a complex interplay of personal loss, cultural duality, and artistic yearning. The heavy doors of the Russian civil service closed behind Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky with a quiet finality in 1863, marking the beginning of a transformation that would alter not only his life but the course of Russian music. Having spent 4 years fulfilling bureaucratic duties at the Ministry of Justice, Tchaikovsky found himself increasingly suffocated by the monotony of government work. The dusty registers and procedural memoranda of office life offered no refuge for a man whose inner world was blooming with melodic visions and poetic intensity. The shift from law to lyricism was neither impulsive nor rebellious. It was the slow awakening of a vocation long dormant beneath the layers of social expectation. St. Petersburg in the 1860s was a city pulsing with artistic energy. Alongside its neoclassical facades and frozen canals, a cultural reawakening was stirring. The city was home to newly established institutions that aimed to elevate the status of Russian music, chief among them the St. Petersburg Conservatory, founded in 1862 by the formidable pianist and composer Anton Rubinstein. It was here that Tchaikovsky would take his decisive leap into music, enrolling as one of the conservatory's first and most promising students. The conservatory offered a kind of intellectual liberation that Tchaikovsky had never experienced before. Surrounded by aspiring composers, vocalists, and instrumentalists, he was immersed in the rigorous study of harmony, counterpoint, orchestration, and musical form. For the first time, he encountered a structured methodology for understanding what had previously been only instinct and emotion. Yet, his approach to learning was not mechanical. He internalized theory like a poet absorbs language, seeing in fugues and cadences the tools to express his inner life with greater clarity. Rubinstein, though a demanding instructor, recognized Tchaikovsky's talent early on. He was particularly struck by the young man's ear for melody and his innate sense of orchestral color. While Tchaikovsky initially struggled with some technical aspects, particularly the strict forms required in counterpoint, he demonstrated an almost mystical ability to convey emotion through sound. His assignments, even those meant to be dry exercises, often brimmed with unexpected lyricism and tonal beauty. It was during this time that his voice as a composer began to emerge in earnest. Life as a student was modest. Tchaikovsky lived frugally, surviving on a small allowance from his father and occasional teaching income. He rented humble rooms in St. Petersburg and often endured cold winters with little comfort. Yet he never complained. These were years of creative hunger, of urgent discovery. By day, he studied under the conservatory's rigid curriculum. By night, he devoured scores by Beethoven, Schumann, and Berlioz, trying to understand how their logic and fire could coexist in a single composition. Tchaikovsky's notebooks from this period are filled with thematic sketches and personal musings, revealing a mind constantly in motion. He wrote with a discipline that bordered on obsession, often revising passages dozens of times to achieve the perfect harmonic progression or expressive nuance. One can trace in these early sketches the embryonic shapes of his future symphonic works, motifs that would later reappear in his mature compositions, more refined but never divorced from their original emotion. It was during this period that Tchaikovsky composed his first publicly performed work. The characteristic dances premiered in 1865 at a concert organized by Rubinstein. Though a modest success, it represented a turning point. No longer merely a student, he was now stepping onto the public stage, albeit cautiously. The applause that followed this first performance confirmed for him what he had begun to suspect. Music was not merely his refuge, it was his destiny. By the time he completed his studies at the conservatory in 1865, Tchaikovsky had transformed from an amateur enthusiast into a professional composer. His final examination piece, a cantata based on Schiller's Ode to Joy, earned high praise and demonstrated his newfound mastery of choral and orchestral forces. More than just a graduation requirement, the cantata was symbolic. It was a musical declaration that he had left behind the world of codes and legal decrees for one governed by feeling and sound. Following graduation, an unexpected opportunity arose. Nikolai Rubinstein, Anton's younger brother and himself a gifted pianist and conductor, invited Tchaikovsky to teach theory at the newly founded Moscow Conservatory. The offer was both prestigious and practical. It provided financial stability and professional validation. Though Tchaikovsky had never taught before, he accepted, moving to Moscow in 1866. It was in this city, far from the artistic epicenter of St. Petersburg, that he would lay the groundwork for his compositional career. The transition from civil servant to composer was not without its uncertainties, but Tchaikovsky approached it with clarity and resolve. His path was no longer dictated by external expectations or familial pressures. Instead, it was shaped by an internal compass pointing toward creative truth. The years at the conservatory had not only trained his intellect, they had awakened his soul. With technique now harnessed to inspiration, Tchaikovsky stood at the threshold of artistic maturity, poised to shape the soundscape of a nation still discovering its musical voice. When Pyotr Tchaikovsky arrived in Moscow in 1866, the city offered little of the imperial grandeur he had left behind in St. Petersburg. Yet, within its less polished streets and budding intellectual circles, he found a quieter, more receptive environment for his musical ambitions. The position at the Moscow Conservatory marked not only the beginning of his teaching career, but also the true birth of his compositional identity. No longer under the watchful eye of Anton Rubinstein or hemmed in by the strictures of academic assignments, Tchaikovsky was now free to experiment, falter, and find his own voice. Living alone in a modest flat near the conservatory, he maintained a disciplined daily routine. Mornings were devoted to teaching, while the evenings were reserved for composing. The contrast between his public and private life was stark. In the classroom, he was methodical and clear, if a bit distant. At home, he plunged into long, introspective periods of creativity, scribbling drafts late into the night by candlelight. His emotional world found an outlet through music, each composition a mirror to the anxieties, hopes, and longings that course beneath his reserved exterior. One of his earliest major works during this period was his Symphony No. 1 in G minor, subtitled Winter Dreams. Composed in 1866 and revised several times thereafter, the symphony displayed both promise and struggle. Though infused with vivid orchestral textures and a yearning, lyrical quality that would become his signature, the work was initially rejected by Anton Rubinstein and his colleagues in St. Petersburg. Devastated by their criticism, Tchaikovsky spiraled briefly into a depression, yet the experience steeled his resolve. Rather than abandon the piece, he revised it, painstakingly, relentlessly, until he produced a version more faithful to his own vision. This early period also saw the creation of his first opera, The Voyevoda, based on a play by Alexander Ostrovsky. Though the opera was performed in 1869, it failed to impress critics or audiences and was soon withdrawn. Disappointed by its reception and unhappy with the score himself, Tchaikovsky eventually destroyed most of the manuscript. But the lessons learned during its composition, how to handle vocal lines, orchestrate dramatic scenes, and pace musical storytelling, would inform his later, more successful operas. Undeterred, Tchaikovsky continued composing with fierce determination. In 1869, he achieved his first real breakthrough with the fantasy overture Romeo and Juliet, inspired by Shakespeare's tragedy. Encouraged by fellow composer Mali Balakarev, who helped shape the structure and dramatic pacing of the piece, Tchaikovsky crafted a work of haunting beauty and emotional immediacy. The piece's soaring love, theme, and tragic climax captivated audiences and critics alike, marking the first time Tchaikovsky was recognized as a serious and distinctive voice in Russian music. His burgeoning reputation did not come without pressure. Expectations mounted as each new composition was received with greater scrutiny. Tchaikovsky, ever sensitive to critique, internalized both praise and criticism deeply. His self-doubt was a constant companion, even during creative highs. It was precisely this emotional volatility, his ability to live within extremes, that gave his music its unique poignancy. He was learning to transform his inner turbulence into public art. Another landmark from this period was his Piano Concerto No. 1 in B-flat minor, composed in 1874. Initially rejected by Nikolai Rubinstein, who called the piece worthless and unplayable, the concerto went on to become one of Tchaikovsky's most beloved works. Rather than revise it according to Rubinstein's scathing feedback, Tchaikovsky sent the score to Hans von Bülow, a German pianist and conductor who premiered it to great acclaim in Boston. This incident symbolized Tchaikovsky's growing confidence in his artistic instincts and his willingness to look beyond Russia for validation. The mid-1870s also saw the composition of his first ballet, Swan Lake. Commissioned by the Moscow Imperial Theaters, the work was a novel endeavor for Tchaikovsky, who had never before composed music for dance. Though the initial performance in 1877 received mixed reviews, more due to poor choreography and staging than the score itself, the music was immediately recognized for its melodic charm and dramatic depth. Tchaikovsky's gift for weaving narrative and emotion into musical form made him uniquely suited to the ballet genre. Outside the concert hall, Tchaikovsky maintained a relatively solitary existence. While his professional life flourished, his social interactions remained cautious and guarded. He developed close but selective friendships, often corresponding more comfortably through letters than in person. These friendships, however, were crucial. They provided emotional anchors in a life frequently shadowed by insecurity and self-doubt. Among these relationships were early connections with future patrons and artistic allies who would play increasingly important roles in his career. By the close of the 1870s, Tchaikovsky had established himself not only as a skilled technician, but as a composer of profound emotional insight. His early works, born from both academic discipline and personal yearning, revealed a mind capable of balancing structure with sentiment. By the mid-1870s, Pyotr Tchaikovsky had carved a place for himself in the Russian musical world, but beneath the growing acclaim lay a deepening turmoil. Though he had gained recognition for his artistic accomplishments, he remained locked in a struggle with personal identity, most notably his sexuality and emotional isolation. This internal conflict reached a breaking point in 1877, when Tchaikovsky made a life-altering and ultimately disastrous decision. He chose to marry. Her name was Antonina Emilyakova, a former music student who had written Tchaikovsky a series of impassioned letters, professing her admiration and love. At first, he ignored her, dismissing her words as the romantic delusions of a distant admirer. But as her letters persisted and his emotional state grew more fragile, he began to entertain the idea. More than love, it was a mix of guilt, social expectation, and desperation that led him to accept her proposal. At the age of 37, he entered into a union he hoped would quiet the inner turmoil he could no longer bear. Their wedding took place hastily in July 1877, and within weeks, Tchaikovsky realized he had made a grave mistake. The incompatibility between the two was immediate and severe. Antonina, though infatuated with him, proved emotionally unstable and unable to understand his needs, while Tchaikovsky found himself repulsed by her presence and overwhelmed by anxiety. Their relationship rapidly disintegrated. What he had hoped would be a refuge became an unbearable psychological burden. Just days into the marriage, Tchaikovsky fled. He sought escape in the countryside, then retreated to Moscow and eventually abroad. During this time, he suffered a complete nervous collapse, possibly attempting to take his own life by wading into the freezing waters of the Moskva River. Whether or not this act was truly suicidal remains debated, but the symbolism was undeniable. The marriage had pushed him to the edge of mental and emotional ruin. The scandal was managed discreetly, but the damage was done. Tchaikovsky never returned to live with Antonina, though they never divorced, remaining legally bound for the rest of his life. She would spend much of her later years in psychiatric care, while Tchaikovsky chose exile over confrontation, traveling across Europe to distance himself from the emotional wreckage. The experience left a deep scar, one that would haunt him privately even as his public stature continued to rise. Amidst this personal chaos, a remarkable relationship began to blossom, one that would provide emotional stability and financial freedom. In the same year as his ill-fated marriage, Tchaikovsky received a letter from Nadezhda von Meck, a wealthy widow and patron of the arts. She had admired his music from afar and offered him a generous stipend to support his work. Intriguingly, the two agreed never to meet in person, communicating instead through hundreds of letters exchanged over more than a decade. This correspondence became a lifeline for Tchaikovsky. Von Meck offered not only financial security, but an emotional connection that, though unconventional, was deeply sincere. Their letters ranged from discussions of art and philosophy to confessions of inner suffering and fleeting joy. She became a confidant in a way few others could, allowing him to express the sides of himself he so often concealed. In her, he found a kind of sanctuary, a relationship without physical pressure, emotional drama, or social danger. It was during this turbulent time that Tchaikovsky composed one of his most celebrated works, the Fourth Symphony in F minor. Completed in 1878, the symphony is often read as a musical representation of fate's relentless presence in his life. The opening fanfare is aggressive and inescapable, representing, in his own words, the force of destiny. Yet amid its tempestuous movements, The work also offers moments of light and lyrical escape, glimpses of peace, perhaps, found in music and correspondence with von Meck. Tchaikovsky also used travel as a form of therapy. He wandered through Switzerland, France, and Italy, absorbing new cultures and writing with renewed vigor. The change in scenery gave him distance from Moscow and the burdens of his failed marriage, allowing him to work on chamber music, art songs, and orchestral suites. These pieces often reflected a more contemplative and sometimes nostalgic tone, as though he were reassembling fragments of himself through harmony and rhythm. Though his marriage to Antonina would cast a long shadow over his emotional life, it also marked a turning point in his creative trajectory. The ordeal forced Tchaikovsky to confront truths about himself that he had long suppressed. It pushed him to seek new forms of emotional expression and to build protective structures around his fragile inner world. Most importantly, it catalyzed a period of profound artistic growth, demonstrating how even the most personal of tragedies could be transformed into works of universal resonance. In the years following the collapse of his marriage, Tchaikovsky increasingly sought refuge abroad, drifting from city to city in a kind of voluntary exile. These years of foreign travel were not aimless. They were part of a deliberate strategy to shield himself from the psychological unrest of Moscow and the burdens of social life in Russia. Though far from home, he was never idle. His journeys became periods of intense creativity, reflection, and solitude, conditions under which his musical voice continued to mature and expand. Europe, to Tchaikovsky, was both escape and inspiration. He spent extended periods in Florence, Rome, Clarens, Switzerland, Paris, and Vienna, each city offering its own rhythm, climate, and flavor. In Italy, he found lightness and melody, inspired by street performers, Italian opera, and the warmth of Mediterranean culture. In Switzerland, the stillness of the mountains gave him space for introspection and structure. He described the calm lakes and quiet villages as ideal settings for composition. Every place left its trace in his music, not as direct quotations, but as impressions distilled into orchestral language. Unlike his earlier student years, when composition was often punctuated by financial worry and self-doubt, Tchaikovsky now worked with the freedom of an independent artist. Thanks to the generous patronage of Nadezhda von Meck, he no longer needed to teach or accept commissions. His routine abroad became almost monastic: long walks in the countryside, meals taken alone or with a close companion, and afternoons filled with composition. This discipline led to a series of new works that revealed the full command of his expressive power. One of the most emblematic products of his travels was the Violin Concerto in D major, composed in 1878 while staying in Clarens on the banks of Lake Geneva. In this piece, one senses the emotional release he found in isolation. The concerto brims with lyrical themes, technical brilliance, and buoyant energy, a stark contrast to the inner turmoil of previous years. Though initially dismissed by some violinists as too difficult and even unplayable, the work eventually became a cornerstone of the violin repertoire, celebrated for its melodic charm and structural clarity. Equally notable from this period is his Serenade for Strings, composed in the same year. While his symphonies often conveyed a battle with destiny, the Serenade was a gentler, more reflective piece. Written in a classical style reminiscent of Mozart, whom Tchaikovsky idolized, it showcased a side of the composer that relished balance, grace, and elegance. These works were not only expressions of craftsmanship, but also therapeutic exercises in beauty and control, helping him stabilize his often wavering mental state. His time abroad also nurtured a broader awareness of international music. In Paris, he attended performances of French opera and ballet, absorbing the refinement of composers like Gounod and Delibes. In Vienna, he engaged with Germanic traditions, though he remained ambivalent about Wagner's growing influence. He admired the technical prowess of German music, but remained cautious of what he viewed as its intellectual excess. His own approach to composition remained grounded in emotional immediacy and structural clarity, qualities that allowed his music to resonate deeply with audiences, even across cultural divides. Although these years were productive, they were not without loneliness. Tchaikovsky, by nature introspective, often wrestled with feelings of isolation during his time abroad. Despite being surrounded by cultural richness, he felt acutely the absence of deep companionship. His correspondence with his brother Modest and with von Meck became even more vital, acting as an emotional lifeline across the distances. The contradictions in his life, fame and solitude, success and doubt, were sharpened in foreign lands. While he avoided public life during his travels, he did not shy away from self-discipline or critical evaluation. He often revised earlier works, returning to sketches and scores with fresh eyes. The perfectionism that marked his creative process only deepened during these years. Whether refining a ballet suite or reshaping a symphonic movement, he approached his compositions with the sensitivity of a sculptor, chiseling away flaws until the piece reflected his evolving aesthetic ideals. His extended absences from Russia were not met without commentary. Critics and nationalists at home sometimes accused him of distancing himself from the Russian tradition, of becoming too westernized in his style and attitude. Tchaikovsky was aware of these accusations, and they troubled him. But he also believed deeply in the universality of music. To him, nationality was not a limitation, but a flavor, important but never all-defining. His music, though often unmistakably Russian in its themes and colors, spoke to the soul rather than the flag. By the early 1880s, the chapter of foreign sojourns began to close. The urge to return to Russia, both as a musical ambassador and as a maturing man, grew stronger. The years abroad had refined him, strengthened his technique, and broadened his emotional vocabulary. They had also reaffirmed his identity as a composer not confined by geography, but shaped by inner conviction. By the early 1880s, Pyotr Tchaikovsky began a gradual return to Russia, not only in a geographic sense, but also in his role as a public figure. The years of wandering through Europe had given him distance and perspective, but a quiet transformation was underway. He was no longer the uncertain, tormented composer battling internal crises. He now returned to his homeland with a heightened sense of purpose and, to his surprise, was met with a growing wave of admiration and official recognition. The climate in Russia's cultural sphere had shifted. While Tchaikovsky had once faced skepticism from nationalist critics and conservative academic circles, time had softened many of his detractors. The younger generation of musicians and critics now viewed him not as a man torn between Russian and Western traditions, but as someone who had forged a uniquely expressive idiom, balancing emotional depth with formal precision. His symphonies and operas were being programmed more frequently, and his name was beginning to appear beside the great figures of European music. One of the pivotal moments in this changing landscape came in 1880, when Tchaikovsky was commissioned to compose a work commemorating the Russian victory over Napoleon in 1812. Though he personally had little enthusiasm for overtly patriotic projects, he accepted the task. The resulting composition, the 1812 Overture, was an audacious piece complete with church bells, cannon fire, and booming brass. It was bold, theatrical, and nationalistic, everything Tchaikovsky usually avoided, and yet it became one of his most famous works. While he privately dismissed it as superficial, audiences embraced its jubilant energy, cementing his place in the public consciousness. Around the same time, another opportunity for national exposure arrived. The opening of the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow, a massive symbol of Russian resilience and imperial pride. Tchaikovsky's music was chosen to accompany the ceremonies, further solidifying his reputation as a composer worthy of representing Russian grandeur. Though he often preferred intimate compositions and emotional subtlety, he had now become a composer of monumental events. In 1884, the Russian Empire extended its hand in the form of formal honors. Tchaikovsky was awarded the Order of Saint Vladimir, an imperial decoration that came not only with prestige, but also a modest hereditary nobility. This recognition stunned him. For years, he had felt like an outsider, unmarried, emotionally withdrawn, and misunderstood, and now he found himself celebrated by the very establishment that once regarded him with suspicion. Though flattered, he received the accolades with a characteristic mix of gratitude and skepticism, never entirely comfortable in the public eye. As part of his reintegration into Russian musical life, Tchaikovsky began accepting invitations to conduct his own works. He had previously avoided the podium, fearing his modest physical presence and shy demeanor would not command an orchestra. However, his tentative steps into conducting were met with success. Though not a virtuoso conductor by temperament, he brought a unique sensitivity to his interpretations. His knowledge of his scores, combined with his expressive gestures, elicited performances of remarkable clarity and emotion. These public appearances brought him into closer contact with the institutions of Russian music. He became more involved with the imperial theaters, offering guidance on new productions of his operas and ballets. He also maintained an advisory role at the Moscow Conservatory, where former students now sought his opinions with reverence. Though he had no desire to become an administrator or reformer, he was increasingly seen as a mentor and elder statesman of Russian music. Despite his rising fame, Tchaikovsky never lost touch with the solitary composer he had been. He often retreated to his countryside retreat in Maiden's Field, Podishkino, or later to Klin, where he could escape the ceremonial duties of his new status. There, surrounded by birch trees and quiet roads, he returned to the piano, the page, and the symphony of inner voices that had always been his truest companions. It was in these quiet interludes that some of his most profound music emerged, far from the fanfare and public recognition. Among the compositions of this period was the Manfred Symphony, a programmatic work inspired by Lord Byron's poem. Unlike his numbered symphonies, this piece explored metaphysical torment and existential despair on a vast orchestral scale. It was ambitious and difficult, and while audiences did not universally embrace it, Tchaikovsky saw it as an important personal statement, a meditation on guilt, longing, and the search for redemption. In many ways, Manfred was the antithesis of the 1812 overture, brooding, complex, and unapologetically introspective. By the mid-1880s, Tchaikovsky had come full circle. Once a marginal figure, now the most performed and decorated composer in Russia. Yet fame did not simplify his inner life. If anything, the pressures of success added new anxieties, the fear of declining inspiration, the weight of public expectation, and the loneliness that accompanied his retreat from personal intimacy. But he endured, composing steadily, moving between public praise and private reflection with the grace of a man who had accepted the contradictions of his life without ever fully resolving them. Though Pyotr Tchaikovsky had already achieved renown through his symphonies and operas, It was in the realm of ballet that his genius would assume a new and enduring form. Prior to his involvement, ballet music in Russia had often been viewed as merely functional, pleasant accompaniment for choreography, but seldom appreciated for its artistic depth. Tchaikovsky changed this perception forever. Through his transformative scores, he elevated ballet to a sophisticated musical art form, investing it with symphonic complexity and psychological nuance. His first foray into ballet came with Swan Lake, commissioned by the Imperial Theaters in the mid-1870s. Though the production initially faltered due to weak choreography and poor staging, Tchaikovsky's score stood out even from the beginning. The music was lush, dramatic, and deeply evocative, telling the story of enchanted swans and doomed love with melodies that lingered long after the curtain fell. The ballet structure reflected his symphonic sensibilities, with recurring motifs and sweeping emotional arcs that far surpassed the decorative style that had dominated ballet up to that point. Tchaikovsky approached ballet not as a background task, but as a serious artistic endeavor. He believed that the emotions of the characters, their conflicts and transformations, could be expressed as powerfully in music as through movement. His themes did not merely underscore the steps, they illuminated inner worlds. The mournful leitmotif associated with Odette, for instance, conveyed a depth of tragedy that no pas de deux could fully articulate on its own. In Tchaikovsky's hands, ballet music became storytelling in motion. After Swan Lake, several years passed before he returned to the genre, but his second ballet project, The Sleeping Beauty, revealed the full maturation of his vision. Inspired by Charles Perrault's fairy tale and structured in close collaboration with choreographer Marius Petipa, the work was an artistic synthesis of courtly grandeur and mythic symbolism. Tchaikovsky's score offered a dazzling array of dances, each with its own tonal language. The waltzes and mazurkas were elegant and stately, while the orchestration shimmered with pastel hues, invoking a world of enchantment and ritual. The composer took particular delight in the thematic clarity of The Sleeping Beauty. Unlike the turmoil of his symphonic works, the ballet allowed for a more ordered universe, one where good triumphed over evil and harmony was restored. He treated the structure with classical precision, ensuring that each act carried both musical and narrative momentum. Critics and audiences alike were struck by the sophistication of the score, which combined the grace of 18th century court music with romantic expressiveness. Tchaikovsky's gift for musical characterization came to its fullest expression in his final ballet, The Nutcracker. Based on E.D.A. Hoffmann's fantastical tale, the ballet allowed him to explore childhood imagination and the surreal logic of dreams. Here, Tchaikovsky experimented with color and texture more freely than ever before. He used the celesta, a relatively new instrument, to create the shimmering, ethereal sound of the Sugar Plum Fairy solo, an effect so novel and charming that it became instantly iconic. The Nutcracker was also notable for its suite-like construction, presenting a series of character dances that painted a kaleidoscopic vision of different cultures through a child's eyes. Though the original production received a lukewarm response, the ballet would eventually become one of the most beloved works in the classical canon, especially in the West, where it grew into a holiday tradition. Tchaikovsky may not have lived to see its full acclaim, but the work embodied his enduring ability to infuse joy, fantasy, and depth into music. One of the reasons his ballets stood apart was his understanding of dramatic pacing. He was not content with simply writing pretty melodies. He shaped the musical arc to match the emotional rhythms of the story. Moments of tenderness were carefully balanced with tension and climax. Transitions between scenes were handled with elegance, using orchestral interludes that seamlessly carried the audience from one tableau to the next. This cinematic approach, rare at the time, anticipated techniques that would later influence film scoring. Tchaikovsky's collaboration with choreographers like Petipa and Ivanov was crucial, though he often worked independently at first. He eventually grew to respect the complexities of dance and the constraints it imposed on music. He tailored his compositions with an acute awareness of tempo, phrasing, and physical movement. It was a reciprocal relationship. His music elevated the choreography, and in turn, the choreography gave physical embodiment to his sonic ideas. The result was a fusion of disciplines that felt wholly organic and timeless. By elevating the musical standards of ballet, Tchaikovsky not only reshaped Russian dance theater, but also influenced generations of composers who followed. His works proved that ballet music could stand on its own as symphonic art, deserving of the same respect as concert works. As Pyotr Tchaikovsky moved into the final years of his life, his music began to reflect a profound duality, an outward mastery over form and technique, and an inward struggle with meaning, mortality, and identity. While he was now at the height of his professional success, admired by audiences in Russia and abroad, his inner life remained troubled by restlessness and a growing sense of spiritual uncertainty. This tension would permeate his late compositions, infusing them with a richness and intensity unmatched even in his earlier works. One of the most notable characteristics of Tchaikovsky's late period was his increasing control over structure. Works like the Piano Trio in A minor, composed in memory of his friend Nikolai Rubinstein, showcase a composer who had transcended youthful impulsivity in favor of mature architecture. The trio unfolds with deliberate elegance, balancing personal grief with classical discipline. Its variations are carefully crafted, evoking both private mourning and public tribute in a dialogue between piano, violin, and cello that feels almost confessional. During these years, he began to distance himself from overt theatricality, favoring instead a deeper introspection in his instrumental writing. Pieces such as the string sextet, Souvenir de Florence, reflect this inward turn. While the music sparkles with Italianate melodies, its underlying textures are intricate and layered, filled with subtle harmonic surprises and counterpoint. The balance between exuberance and discipline, so characteristic of Tchaikovsky's mature style, is here rendered with exceptional clarity. Despite this artistic refinement, Tchaikovsky's personal writings from the period suggest a man increasingly preoccupied with existential doubt. His letters reveal a recurring fear of artistic decline, as though each completed work might be his last meaningful statement. He often questioned the sincerity of his inspiration, wondering whether his music had become a repetition of former gestures rather than a wellspring of genuine emotion. These doubts gnawed at him, even as his compositions continued to garner acclaim. The burden of fame also weighed more heavily. International tours and conducting engagements, while prestigious, exhausted him. He was celebrated in cities like Hamburg, Prague, and Paris, yet the rituals of recognition, banquets, receptions, formal introductions, left him cold. He yearned for solitude even as he was drawn into public roles he could not refuse. This contradiction was emblematic of his later life. Outwardly successful, inwardly restless. Perhaps no work embodies the complexity of this period more vividly than the Symphony No. 6 in B minor, the Pathetic. Completed just days before his death, it is widely regarded as his most personal and emotionally charged symphony. Unlike his previous symphonies, it ends not in triumph or resolution, but in despair and fading breath. The final movement, with its hushed strings, and descending lines seems to vanish in his silence. An extraordinary gesture that challenged 19th century expectations of symphonic closure. Tchaikovsky never offered a detailed explanation of the Pathetic's program, though he hinted that it contained a narrative of deep significance. Some speculate that the symphony was a coded farewell, a meditation on life and death, or even a veiled confession. Regardless of interpretation, its emotional immediacy is undeniable. From the brooding intensity of the opening to the violent second movement and the eerie waltz-like third, the symphony moves like a soul in turmoil, searching, grasping, and finally yielding. In these late compositions, there's also a growing sense of ambiguity. Harmonies are more chromatic, transitions more unexpected, and cadences less final. This was not simply a stylistic evolution. It reflected a psychological one. Tchaikovsky seemed increasingly drawn to the unknown, the unresolved. He experimented with musical forms that mirrored emotional uncertainty, as if recognizing that life, unlike music, does not always resolve in a neat cadence. Despite the shadow of melancholy, he continued to produce at an impressive pace. He worked on revisions of earlier pieces, sketched ideas for future operas, and kept a meticulous record of his activities. This paradox of productive labor amid psychological struggle underscores the complexity of his late years. He did not retreat from his art. He immersed himself in it, even when it no longer offered the comfort or clarity it once had. By the end of his life, Tchaikovsky was a man suspended between legacy and longing. He had achieved artistic immortality, yet he remained haunted by the limits of expression and the questions that music could not answer. As the 1890s advanced, Pyotr Tchaikovsky found himself caught in the slow current of both culmination and farewell. While he could not have known the end was near, the atmosphere of his final years carried the weight of inevitability. Increasingly celebrated across Europe, he was at once a composer of global stature and a man wrapped in personal silences. His late travels, public honors, and final performances painted the portrait of an artist simultaneously embraced by the world and estranged from himself. Tchaikovsky's final European journey began in earnest in 1891, when he was invited to the United States to participate in the grand opening of Carnegie Hall in New York City. This voyage marked one of the rare moments when he ventured across the Atlantic. The American audiences received him with enthusiasm, and his conducting of several of his own works was met with standing ovations. Yet even in success, Tchaikovsky felt a subtle disconnect. He admired the energy and ambition of the New World, but he found its cultural landscape unfamiliar, even overwhelming. The trip was short-lived, and he returned to Europe with a renewed longing for the familiar shadows of home. In the years that followed, the crescendo of recognition continued. Tchaikovsky was granted honorary degrees, among them one from the University of Cambridge, an acknowledgement not only of his compositions, but of his international cultural significance. These formal accolades, conferred by institutions outside of Russia, reflected how far his influence had reached. He was no longer just a national treasure. He was a pillar of 19th century European art, spoken of alongside Brahms and Wagner. Despite his continued success, the whirlwind of travel and ceremony exhausted him. He accepted conducting engagements in Berlin, Prague, and Paris, and though he performed with elegance, each trip seemed to sap a part of his vitality. The long train rides, the diplomatic receptions, the unfamiliar hotels, all wore down a temperament that had always leaned towards solitude. Still, he never ceased to fulfill his commitments. His professionalism remained intact, even as his inner world seemed increasingly remote and abstracted. Back in Russia, Tchaikovsky continued to engage with musical life in a more reflective, supervisory capacity. He advised younger composers, attended premieres, and was often consulted for his opinion on matters of cultural policy. Yet, even amid these duties, he withdrew more often into the sanctuary of his estate in Klin, where he took refuge in routine. Morning walks, afternoon reading, and long hours of composition by lamplight. Here, away from the formalities of European halls, he returned to himself in quiet increments. During this time, he began sketching ideas for a new symphony, one that would follow the Pathetic. Though no official plan survived beyond a few pages, contemporaries recalled his vague references to another grand orchestral work. However, these ideas remained fragmented, never coalescing into a new score. Instead, he spent time refining existing pieces, orchestrating, and attending to correspondence. There was a sense that the flow of inspiration was slowing, though not absent, more like a tide retreating, gathering before a final surge. The fall of 1893 brought a moment of high acclaim. In St. Petersburg, he conducted the premiere of the Pathetic Symphony. The audience, unsure how to interpret the work's melancholy final movement, responded with polite, if restrained, applause. Tchaikovsky, however, was visibly moved by the experience. Those close to him remarked on his unusually solemn demeanor after the concert. He said little, yet his eyes betrayed a gaze fixed somewhere beyond the concert hall, as if the performance had opened a private corridor between sound and silence. Only 9 days after that premiere, Tchaikovsky fell ill. Accounts of his death remained shadowed by contradiction. The official cause, cholera, contracted from drinking unboiled water, seemed plausible during a time of outbreaks. Yet speculation has persisted. Some have suggested suicide, others a court-ordered silencing related to rumors about his private life. The truth remains elusive, as those who surrounded him in his final hours offered only vague or conflicting accounts. What is clear is that his passing on November 6, 1893, at the age of 53, was sudden and deeply felt across the musical world. Russia mourned him with rare solemnity. His funeral was held at the Cathedral of Our Lady of Kazan in St. Petersburg, attended by thousands. Among the pallbearers were prominent writers, musicians, and members of the aristocracy. At his burial in the Tikhvin Cemetery, near the graves of Glinka and Dostoevsky, choirs sang from his own sacred works. In that moment, Tchaikovsky became more than a composer. He was a symbol of national cultural identity, his music woven into the spiritual fabric of his country. The death of Pyotr Tchaikovsky in 1893 was not the conclusion of his story, but the beginning of his immortality. In the years following his passing, his music underwent a profound transformation in its reception, growing into a cornerstone of the global classical repertoire. Tchaikovsky's ability to convey raw emotion and his revolutionary approach to orchestration, melody, and form ensured that his works would never fade into obscurity. Over time, the composer's genius not only solidified his place in Russian musical history, but also helped to define the global landscape of classical music. In Russia, Tchaikovsky was immediately mourned as a national hero. He had, in many ways, come to embody the emotional heart of Russian music. His compositions became the foundation for Russian orchestral and operatic traditions. His influence on Russian composers, such as Sergei Rachmaninoff and Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, cannot be overstated. They inherited his dedication to emotional expressiveness, his mastery of orchestral color, and his use of nationalistic themes. Yet, Tchaikovsky's music transcended national boundaries. By the early 20th century, he had become a fixture in the international concert halls of Europe and America, where his works were embraced by audiences from all walks of life. Tchaikovsky's ballets, Swan Lake, The Sleeping Beauty, and The Nutcracker, are perhaps his most widely performed and celebrated works. These compositions continue to captivate audiences worldwide, not only in the theater, but also in the concert hall. The Nutcracker in particular has become an indelible part of the Western holiday season. Its music is familiar as Christmas itself. The stunning melodies of the dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy or the lush swirls of the Waltz of the Flowers evoke a sense of wonder and nostalgia that endures year after year. But it is not only in ballet where Tchaikovsky's music left its mark. His symphonies, especially the Pathetic Symphony, have inspired generations of composers to explore the depths of human emotion through orchestral music. The symphony's somber opening, the tragic second movement, and the quiet resignation of the final movement became paradigms of the expressive potential of the symphonic form. Through these works, Tchaikovsky offered a language of musical vulnerability, where listeners could experience the catharsis of emotion through sound. Tchaikovsky's opera legacy is equally significant, though his operatic works were often dismissed by critics during his lifetime. Operas like Eugene Onegin and The Queen of Spades are now considered masterpieces, their rich orchestration and emotional depth revealing Tchaikovsky's acute understanding of character and drama. In Eugene Onegin, the subtle interplay between the music and the libretto evokes the despair of unrequited love and the crushing weight of societal expectations. In The Queen of Spades, his skillful use of motifs heightens the sense of madness and obsession, creating a powerful psychological portrait that was ahead of its time. As the 20th century progressed, Tchaikovsky's influence spread far beyond classical music. His works became a source of inspiration for composers in other genres. The emotional intensity and vivid orchestration of his music provided fertile ground for cinematic composers, who often cited him as a precursor to the grand scores of Hollywood. John Williams, the composer behind the iconic scores of Star Wars and Jurassic Park, frequently acknowledged Tchaikovsky as a formative influence. Similarly, his use of leitmotifs, the recurring musical themes that represent characters or ideas, became a hallmark of cinematic scoring, a technique that has endured in modern film music. Tchaikovsky's emotional expressiveness, combined with his mastery of form, gave his works an accessibility that resonated universally. His melodies were instantly memorable, and his use of the orchestra was innovative and immersive, capable of evoking a wide range of human experiences. Whether through the sweeping passion of his first piano concerto, the poignant lyricism of his violin concerto, or the rich textures of his symphonic works, Tchaikovsky was able to convey the deepest parts of the human soul, making his music a timeless vehicle for emotional resonance. Another aspect of Tchaikovsky's enduring legacy is his ability to blend the personal with the universal. His struggles with self-doubt, his complex inner life, and his deep emotional vulnerability are encapsulated in his music. The symphonies, ballets, and operas are not just works of genius. They're the artistic expression of a man who, despite his acclaim, never fully resolved the internal tensions that marked his life. His music, then, stands as a mirror to the human experience, revealing both the beauty and the fragility of existence. This deeply personal element in his compositions has ensured that Tchaikovsky's works continue to touch listeners on a profound, intimate level. As the decades passed, Tchaikovsky's work became more than just musical art. It became part of the cultural fabric of the 19th and 20th centuries. His music was performed at key events, from royal celebrations to the memorial services for world leaders. The sound of his compositions transcended the concert hall, finding a place in celebrations of human achievement, in times of mourning, and in the daily lives of millions. The depth of feeling in his works, whether joyful or sorrowful, has allowed them to endure and evolve alongside changing tastes and cultural shifts. Today, Tchaikovsky is universally regarded as one of the greatest composers of the Romantic era. His legacy continues to grow, not just through the ongoing performances of his works, but through the countless adaptations of his music. Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, with its bombastic finale, is played in stadiums and on national holidays. His Swan Lake and the Nutcracker are performed by ballet companies worldwide, and his violin concerto remains a staple of the violin repertory. Pyotr Tchaikovsky, once a solitary, conflicted artist, has transcended his own life and struggles, becoming a symbol of universal emotion and artistic brilliance. Through the lasting power of his music, he lives on, a central figure not just in Russian culture, but in the global imagination. His music, as vibrant and poignant today as it was over a century ago, stands as a reminder of the power of art to communicate the deepest aspects of the human condition, bridging time, place, and language.